Last week was our first playoff game, and my plaque psoriasis was so itchy under all my gear. Sometimes just thinking about scratching could take me out of the moment. And then my doctor told me I could get clearer skin with a pill called Otezla.
Otezla apremilast is a prescription medicine used to treat adult patients with plaque psoriasis for whom phototherapy or systemic therapy is appropriate. Otezla can help you get clearer skin after just 4 months.
Okay, ready for the next game. Talking to my doctor about a pill was a total game changer.
Don't use Otezla if you're allergic to it. Get medical help right away if you have trouble breathing or swallowing, swelling of the face, lips, tongue, throat, or arms. Severe diarrhea, nausea or vomiting, depression, suicidal thoughts, or weight loss can happen. Tell your doctor if any of these occur and if you have a history of depression or suicidal thoughts. Live in the moment. Ask your doctor about Otezla. Call 1-844-4-OTEZLA or visit Otezla.com for prescribing info about cost, and more.
It's The Other Side of Midnight with Frank Morano.
This is The Other Side of Midnight. I'm Frank Morano. One of my favorite phrases, it's repeated so often it has absolutely become a cliche. I'm not even 100% sure what it means. Is that history doesn't always repeat itself, but it does rhyme. It's one of those phrases that I hear all the time, and I feel like I kind of know what it means, but I love hearing it and repeating it anyway. And in order to inform us on where we are today and how we got here, I think it's really essential to look at the precedents of past presidents as we're going into this debate tonight, and it's going to be very historic either way. I think it's helpful to look at a couple of people that helped create the precedents for the modern day presidency as we know it. And the go-to person on those early presidential precedents I have found to be Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky. She's an award-winning historian of the presidency, political culture, and government institutions, and she's an author whose latest book is out now. It's called Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents That Forged the Republic. She also happens to be the new executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library in Mount Vernon. Lindsay, it's great to talk to you again.
It's great to talk with you. Thank you so much for having me.
So are you guys having a big debate watch party tonight at the George Washington Presidential Library?
No, I think that we are very content to study presidents who didn't really have to go through with these public debates, although I will certainly be paying attention as a student of the presidency more generally.
You know, it's interesting because those of us that started paying attention to presidential politics in the 20th century, we almost always think of these presidential debates as having been there. It's almost considered as much a part of the election as the election itself, as much a part of the presidency as the State of the Union. And the fact is, these debates have really not been an integral part of American presidential history. George Washington and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, those guys weren't participating in any debates when they ran, were they?
That is so right. In fact, really the first real debate was Nixon-Kennedy. So we're talking about just very recent history. And it was just really not a part of presidential elections or presidential politics more broadly. Because I think, debates are interesting and they can tell us a lot of things about a person, but they don't necessarily tell us whether or not they're going to be a good president.
Yeah, oh, that's for sure. I mean, they tell you how you could perform in front of a television audience and repeat a one-liner or two. And by the way, if people think Lindsay Chervinsky has taken leave of her senses and has totally forgotten the Lincoln-Douglas debates because everyone remembers how tight that 1860 election was between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas, those Lincoln-Douglas debates weren't even presidential debates, right? They were for a U.S. Senate seat.
Yes, that's right. So they were debating for the Illinois Senate seat. And so what people remember about it is that it really put Lincoln on the map. It was when people really began to know who he was, but it was not a part of the presidential election cycle.
As far as the election of 1796 and 1800 have gone, we talked a little bit about this the last time you were here. Both of those were Jefferson-Adams contests, and especially that 1800 contest seems like it was pretty bitter. How did people decide who to vote for? You had a situation where they couldn't simply look up all the candidates' positions on the internet. How did folks know in those days who they agreed with more on stuff?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think it's worth starting off by saying that only about 13% of people who are living in the United States were permitted to vote because most women, people of color, indentured servants, the enslaved did not have suffrage. So we're really talking about white men of property that had the ability to exercise the franchise. And so when they were deciding who to vote, typically they relied on a couple of ways to get information. And one of the key ways was newspapers. Newspapers tended to print articles, they printed updated events, and even if you were not literate, you would probably learn about these newspapers because people would pass them around between families. They would read them aloud in either taverns or in family homes. And the same was true with letters. People would often send letters with the intention of them being shared. And that was how they learned about various positions. And then depending what their economic priorities were, depending how they felt about foreign policy, depending on how they felt about what they wanted the government to prioritize. So not dissimilar to today, that was how they then picked their alliances.
You mentioned a minute ago that the debates themselves are not an indication of how good or bad a president someone is going to be. As a student of the presidency more generally and of government institutions and so forth, do you think these debates matter?
Well, I think generally the consensus is that they don't matter, but it's pretty hard to say that in the year 2024, given that the last debate was so significant and had such a huge impact. So I think that most of the time they don't, but on occasion they can either confirm what people are already thinking, they can help assuage concerns that maybe people had. So, the famous example of that is Ronald Reagan when he made the quip about he would not use his opponent's inexperience and youth against him. But I think it probably will matter tomorrow or tonight just because of, everything that has happened thus far this year and the fact that this is such a weird election so far, and people are sort of just getting accustomed to the fact that we have candidates that you're not anticipating.
Your book deals with John Adams, and John Adams clearly, even if he'd never been president, had a fascinating life. The first vice president, someone that was integral in the formulation of the Declaration of Independence and the movement for independence, even his work as a lawyer in colonial America, his work as an early American diplomat, a fascinating guy. Your book is not so much a biography as a look at his presidency and the events immediately surrounding and following it. And it's all about a lot of the precedents that John Adams set that you say forged the republic. What were some of the major precedents that Adams set as president? Because I feel like these days the consensus among regular folks when it comes to John Adams is great American, incredible diplomat, incredible historical figure, but not a very good president. What were the precedents that he set?
That's definitely been the sort of common narrative thus far. And so my hope is that this book pushes back on that a little bit, because I think there are three critical precedents that Adams was really responsible for establishing that have gone overlooked. The first was he proved that someone else could be president. And that sounds like sort of a duh question, but at the time, there was real uncertainty about whether or not the office of the presidency would actually work with anyone other than Washington in it, because it had enormous powers and it had enormous privileges and responsibilities, and Americans and people across the globe were not sure if this office would work without someone of Washington's just extraordinary stature and the respect that people had for him. And Adams knew that it was going to be very difficult for him to follow in Washington's footsteps, and he was absolutely going to fall short, but he did it anyway. And so the fact that he showed up and proved that it could be done was so pivotal to the survival of the institution. The second critical precedent was he was very defensive of executive power, not necessarily his own power, but executive power. And he fought back against attempts by Congress and the cabinet to make the presidency into more of a governing by committee, like the British cabinet is today. And so that really defined the character of our executive branch and the presidency more broadly. And then the third precedent, and is I think probably the most important, is he was the common denominator and the central touchstone of the first two peaceful transfers of power. And it turns out peaceful transfer of power is absolutely essential to democracy. It is what makes a democracy. It's very hard to create that tradition and to teach Americans to cultivate and cherish it. And it started with Adams, and he understood that it had to be done with incredible care, and that intentionality is so important and I think deserves really to be celebrated.
Last time we chatted, we talked about Adams' appointment of George Washington as the senior officer of the United States Army. You said that you didn't think this was necessarily a high point in George Washington's career, especially his post-presidential career. But your book makes clear that there was real concern about America and national security because of the quasi-war with France that was going on at the time. I feel like when I talk to people about this period of American history, everyone feels like they have a fairly good understanding of the American Revolution and a pretty good understanding of the War of 1812. And as far as the French, hey, obviously we know that they helped us out in our war against the British. I don't really feel like there's even an awareness among modern Americans about this quasi-conflict with the French in 1798. Educate us. What was that all about?
Well, I think you're right. I think it's a really misunderstood, or maybe even not all that well known. Mm-hmm. So, as you said, France was one of the big allies to the United States during the Revolution. That relationship began to fray in Washington's administration when the administration signed the Jay Treaty with Great Britain. And France really felt like this treaty sort of undermined its special status, and they resented that. And they started responding. I mean, they were at war with Britain. They had been at war with Britain off and on for decades and centuries and will continue to be so. They responded by seizing American ships, selling off the goods, and imprisoning American sailors. So obviously this was extremely unpopular behavior among Americans because no one wanted that to happen. And yet war was never actually declared. And when Adams sent a peace commission to France, they were treated very poorly. But again, war was never declared. And so there was this weird sort of middle status in which Congress wasn't totally sure what to do and didn't want to necessarily declare war until the president asked for it. But Adams really wanted to preserve the possibility of diplomacy, and France hadn't declared war. And so it was trying to see kind of what it could get away with from the United States. And when the United States responded with strength, Congress passed a number of really important defensive measures, including critically creating a Navy and a Naval Department, which, previously had not existed. Then France really backed off. And so that was like the crux of the quasi-war, and that really dominated Adams' presidency. And one of the key things was trying to figure out how to potentially prepare for war. And, we, as you mentioned, we talked previously about Washington's role in that, and that gets at the challenge of Adams because it's hard enough for a president to be in office with former presidents kind of lingering out there. Mm-hmm. Washington was such a huge figure that he couldn't not include him in preparing for that war effort. But obviously that put him in an impossible situation. So it was a very difficult challenge for Adams to manage.
Going to the gym can be discouraging, especially if you're putting in the work but barely seeing changes. But with Tonal, you can actually see your progress with every workout. Tonal provides the convenience of a full gym and the expertise of a personal trainer anytime at home with one sleek system. Designed to reduce your mental load, Tonal is the ultimate strength training system, helping you focus less on workout planning and more on getting results. No more second-guessing your technique. Tonal gives you real-time coaching cues to dial in your form and help you lift safely safely and effectively. After a quick assessment, Tonal sets the optimal weight for every move and adjusts in 1 pound increments as you get stronger, so you're always challenged. Tonal lets you choose from a variety of expert-led workouts, from strength to aero hit to yoga and mobility, to keep you coming back for more. For a limited time, go to Tonal.com to get $500 off your Tonal purchase, plus a free 4-year warranty. That's Tonal.com for $500 off, plus a free 4-year warranty. Tonal.com.
There were clearly a lot of conflicts with Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton was a leader of the Federalist Party. John Adams was a Federalist president. These days, if you're the president, especially an incumbent president, you're basically the de facto leader of your party. That clearly was not the case in 1800. Why was Adams feuding so much with members of his own party? I can understand why he'd be at loggerheads with the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans, but why did his fellow Federalists take issue with him?
That's a great question. So the Federalist Party was an incredibly weak party in the 1790s. And what that meant was there was not this sort of institutional protection for multiple different perspectives. And so the party could not protect the more moderate voices from the more extreme voices. And Adams definitely represented the moderate wing of the Federalist Party, whereas Hamilton and his allies in the cabinet, including Timothy Pickering and Oliver Wolcott Jr., and some of their other allies in Congress, represented the more extreme wing. And as they began to differ over policy, in particular, Adams distrusted Hamilton's politicization of the army and really wanted to pursue diplomacy with France, whereas the extreme wing wanted war with France because they felt like that would be politically advantageous. The two different sides of the party began to bicker, and the extreme wing of the party actually saved its most virulent rhetoric and its nastiest public criticism for members of their own party that they deemed to be too squishy, which I think is a really important parallel to today because we often see that. And it made Adams' life nearly impossible because he was, of course, battling against the Jeffersonian Republicans, but he also had this wing of his own party that was trying to undermine his foreign policy and what he was trying to achieve.
So they would have been calling Adams a FINO, Federalist in name only, if
exactly.
if they were running around with acronyms back then. Somebody that also became a Federalist was John Adams' son, John Quincy Adams, who's also in his own right a fascinating historical figure. We spoke a little bit in our first conversation about Adams' relationship with George Washington. We spoke last time about his relationship with Jefferson. You characterized them, I think, very aptly as lifelong frenemies. What was John Adams' relationship like with his son, John Quincy Adams? And did John Adams view that as something of a betrayal when Quincy left the Federalists to join the Democratic Republicans?
Their relationship is, I think, one of my favorites. It's very special. It's complex because obviously when your father is the president and you've, worked for him in various political capacities for a long time, that's going to be a little bit messy. But John Adams was so proud of John Quincy Adams. He was so proud of his diplomatic expertise, of his knowledge, of his rigorous adherence to principles, and just absolutely adored his son. And I do think the feeling was actually mutual because they had had a lot of really incredible shared experiences in Europe when they were traveling together. And they were each other's only sort of contact that they knew when they were going to these new places. And so the relationship was really rare. It was very special. And one of my favorite John Adams letters occurred in 1824 when John Quincy won the presidency, and John Adams wrote to him that he had no words. And that was pretty rare for John Adams to have no words. So I really enjoyed that letter. But when John Quincy was in the Senate and he split with some of the Federalists and ended up supporting a lot of Jefferson's policies, I think Adams actually really understood that and appreciated it because he believed it was really important to do the right thing for the nation as opposed to one's allegiance to a political party. And so he understood and supported John Quincy's positions because they were principled as opposed to blind adherence to the party line.
When we talk about precedents, obviously there are a whole bunch of precedents surrounding the modern day role of First Lady. There's so many things that the First Lady is expected to do in public and in a wide variety of other factors, and a lot of things that the First Lady is expected not to do. What kind of a First Lady was Abigail Adams, and did she set any precedents that future First Ladies adhered to?
Well, Abigail is one of my favorite parts of this book because I think that she was such an extraordinary figure, and a lot of people only really know her for the Remember the Ladies letter, but she was so much more than that. So in terms of the official duties of the First Lady, Abigail really adhered to the model that was established by Martha Washington, which was to host weekly gatherings, usually on Friday evenings, for sort of elite men and women. And these spaces are really essential for the sort of networking and behind the scenes politicking that made the government run then and often makes it run now. And so she really didn't veer far from the model that Martha had set, which was to sort of be a hostess, but to not have much of a public role. However, privately, she was John Adams' most important advisor, and his critics often derided her by saying that she was his cabinet of one. But it was actually the most accurate criticism because she was always the first to know everything and reviewed everything and read everything and was so savvy about how people worked, about how the world worked, and how foreign policy worked. And so one cannot understand politics of the 1790s or politics of John Adams' administration without seeing her role in it because she was so central to so many of those conversations.
You characterized John Adams a few minutes ago as a more moderate Federalist, not an extreme Federalist in any which way. Was Adams ideological at all? It seems like his framework in making decisions didn't necessarily come because of adherence to any sort of ideological viewpoint. Would you characterize Adams as an ideological guy?
No, I wouldn't. I think he was very much not ideological. He took great pride in not being a party man, and he believed, I think if he did adhere to an ideological line, it was he was incredibly loyal to the Republic. He believed in the experiment that he spent most of his life creating. He also believed quite firmly that it was very important for the United States to engage intellectually and economically on the world stage, but that at this point, neutrality was quite essential because none of the European nations had any interest in protecting the United States or engaging with the United States in a way that had their best interests at heart. And so neutrality was really important as a way to build the nation's strength and its economy for future generations.
What about Washington? Was he an ideological guy?
No, he wasn't. What's interesting about John Adams and George Washington is that they, as two dead white dudes in the 1790s go, their personalities probably couldn't be more different. But their positions on a lot of things were really, really similar. So Washington shared that same commitment to neutrality. He did not see himself as a party man either. They did want to kind of hold themselves above the fray. They didn't want to be bogged down in one position. They weren't violently pro-French or pro-British. And so I think both of them actually really had a very nationalistic perspective that believed very strongly in the Republic, but they were not the sort of ideologue like Jefferson or Hamilton that we typically associate in the early Republic.
I realize this is not necessarily in the scope of your book, but I am curious because John Adams had one of the longest post-presidencies for many, many years, and he lived until, to be 90 at a time when the average life expectancy was well short of that. There was no presidential pension back then or anything like that. How did John Adams make money and pay his bills after being president?
Well, John Adams had been very fortunate that he had handed over his finances to his wife, Abigail, when he first left the country to go to Europe as a diplomat. And she had been a very savvy investor. She had been a speculator during the war, which maybe was not totally on the up and up, but she was very smart about their money, and she had invested it, she had expanded it, she had purchased additional property. And so while they were not particularly cash rich, they did have they had excellent land. They had really important farmland. They were able to sort of support themselves in that way. And then in his final years, John Quincy Adams did help them with the organization of their finances, not necessarily financially supporting them, but just keeping an eye on how the farm was running and making sure that it was continuing to support the family.
Gotcha. And finally, Lindsay, if you had to pick the better John Adams, or at least the more realistic John Adams based on your understanding of his personality, is it Paul Giamatti or is it William Daniels?
I think it's probably Paul Giamatti, but I think even that tends to be a little bit more crotchety and a little bit more grumpy and negative. And he really did have a sense of humor and a sense of joy. And so I think you got to add a little splash of humor to that approach, and then it would be pretty accurate.
All right. Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, if you want to check out the book, everybody is talking about the book. It is, really an incredible look at an aspect of American history that is looked at far too infrequently. It's called Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents That Forged the Republic. And Lindsay, I'm certainly looking forward to one day taking a visit to the George Washington Presidential Library, and I hope that's going well for you as well.
It is. Thank you. You're welcome anytime. I look forward to it very much.
Thank you. If you want to comment on any portion of our conversation, you could give me a call at 646-720-0635. That's 1-646-720-0635. This is The Other Side of Midnight. Straight ahead.